Last week we started this journey that we're on together, walking through the book of Ruth. And last time we were together, we looked at just Ruth chapter 1, focusing specifically on the heartache and the four catastrophic events that Naomi faced, right? You remember what the four were, the famine, and what would a mom do to try to make sure her two boys had their next meal, moving to a foreign land, a land where most Israelites didn't want to go, the death of her husband and the death of her two sons. And she returns to Israel a bitter, her own words, right? Not mine, a bitter, empty, hopeless widow. And the only light that she has in her life, the only glimpses of hope, whether she sees it or not, is that the famine has ended and that one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, is by her side. But Naomi and Ruth are still in a tough spot. They don't have any husbands. They still lack security. That's where we left off in chapter 1. What does chapter 2 bring us? Here's what it says in verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. That was Naomi's husband. His name was Boaz. Ruth, the Moabitess, asked Naomi, "Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor?" And Naomi answered her, "Go ahead, my daughter." We now have three main characters in this story. Naomi, the seemingly hopeless, bitter, grieving widow and mother. Ruth, the Moabitess, the foreigner, also a widow. But now we're introduced to this third character, Boaz. Now it's interesting how the different Bible translations describe Boaz. In the CSB, which I typically read from, he's described as a prominent man of noble character. Other translations describe him as a worthy man or a man of great wealth, a man of standing. Quite literally, the words used to describe Boaz mean a mighty man of valor. And we learn that Boaz was a distant relative from Elimelech's family. Again, that was Naomi's husband. And Ruth, recognizing the situation they're in, she takes the initiative to go out and to care for herself and Naomi. And she references this part of Israelite law that came from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. That's where we read about it. It says, "When you reap the harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, don't go back to get it. It is to be left for the resident alien," that is the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. In other words, when you go and you're harvesting grain or barley, there's some stuff that's going to get spilled onto the ground. Don't go back and pick that up. And they're to leave it there for two reasons. One, it allowed the foreigners, the orphans, the widows, to go out and to harvest the leftovers in the field, to go out and to work for themselves, to get some food to help take care of themselves. The second reason they were just supposed to leave it is it allowed the farmers to, express their gratitude to God for his abundant provision. God has provided for them, so much so that if a little gets spilled and left behind, everything's going to be okay. So Ruth's got that in mind. Naomi must have told her about that at some point. So here's what Ruth does next, verse 3. So Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. She happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. I love the way this verse says it. Verse 3, she happened to be. The NIV says, as it turned out. Of all the fields that she could have gone to, she went to this one. Now, since we already were introduced to Boaz in the first couple of verses, it's clear that he isn't just going to be a minor player in this story. They tell us about him and then bring him into the story by saying, just so happens that Ruth wound up in his field. But in the moment, what you and I, or maybe Ruth and Naomi might have viewed as just a mere coincidence, we can now see that this was God's providence at work. Right? Directing Ruth to be exactly where he wanted her to be. And again, For the second time in just a few verses, it's mentioned that Boaz is a distant relative of Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. Kind of seems like that's a spoiler, doesn't it? I mean, they keep mentioning this. It seems like that's going to be an important part of the story. We'll keep that in mind. Of course, it's going to come up again. Let me read a longer passage now. And let me remind you what I said last week, that over 70% of the verses in Ruth contain dialogue. That's how the story is primarily told. This chapter is no different. Verse 4. Later, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they replied. And Boaz asked his servant who was in charge of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab." She asked, "Will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvesters?" She came and has been on her feet since early morning, except that she rested a little in the shelter. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled." And she fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner?" Boaz answered her, "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother, your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done. May you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." "My lord," she said, "I have found favor with you, for you have comforted and encouraged your servant, although I am not like one of your female servants." At mealtime, Boaz told her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce." So she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain. She ate and was satisfied, had some left over. When she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her even gather grain among the bundles. Don't humiliate her. Pull out some stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her." So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and it was about 26 quarts of barley. Wow, what a day this turns out to be for Ruth. Just try to put yourself in Ruth's mindset. We tried to put ourselves in Naomi's mind last time. Let's think about what this would have been like from Ruth's perspective. She sets out early in the morning, probably not knowing what she's going to find. She feels a responsibility to care for Naomi, but as the author of Ruth keeps reminding us, she is a foreigner. She's not from here. And maybe Ruth knew about that command from Deuteronomy that we had read a moment ago, but other people knowing about it, but then actually following it, are probably two different things. So Ruth heads out, not sure what she's going to find. She just so happens to come across this field of Boaz. She asks permission to go into the field, and we learned in our reading that she's a very diligent worker. She works really hard. And we learned that about Ruth and the things that we read, but we also learned a lot more about Boaz in this dialogue. What do we see? Well, we learned why he was a man of noble character, why he's described that way. Two things. First, Boaz talked the talk. He talked the talk. What do I mean? Well, verse 4, right? We read that Boaz, when he comes upon his field, he talks to his harvesters, his employees, the hired help. And he gives them these just warm spiritual greetings. Like he takes time to just stop and talk. You know, the folks that maybe we might have just been tempted to just walk past without even giving them the time of day. Boaz stops and talks to them. He talked the talk. But more importantly than that, he walked the walk. Boaz went above and beyond in caring for Ruth. There are several things that we can notice here. He gives Ruth permission to pick up the leftovers through several weeks of the harvesting. And normally when this would happen, the gleaners, that's what Ruth is doing here, they would move in to the field after the harvesters had vacated the area. Then they would come along behind them. But he invites Ruth and tells her, hey, just work right alongside the harvesters. You don't have to wait. And he tells Ruth, I want you to work here, nowhere else, because I will protect you. I've given very strict orders that no one is to harm you in any way. And in fact, you don't even have to go get your own water. Here's some water over here, freshly drawn up, and you have access to that anytime that you want it. And not only did he give her access to water, but he gave her plenty of good food. Right? This was the food that he was eating, that everybody was eating. It says they dipped this bread in vinegar sauce. I thought about trying to demonstrate that. Last week we demonstrated the cocoa powder. I think I learned my lesson with the cocoa powder, not going to mess around with the vinegar sauce this week. But he gives her plenty of good food, so much so that she has some left over to take back to Naomi. We'll see that here in a few verses. He goes above and beyond what's expected in caring for Ruth. This response that Boaz has is simply amazing. It's God at work. The workers had to know it was above and beyond. Right? They didn't just do this for anybody. So for Boaz to be treating Ruth in this way, the workers had to recognize that. Ruth had to recognize it. In fact, we know that she did. She knew that Boaz was going above and beyond because she said to him in verse 10, why have I found favor with you, even though I'm a foreigner? I'm not from around here. Why are you doing all of this for me? Ruth knew it, and of course Naomi knew that it was above and beyond. Here's what happens when Ruth gets back to the house. Verse 18, she picked up the grain and went into the town where her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She brought out what she had left over from her meal and gave it to her. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you gather barley today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you. We read that Ruth came back with 26 quarts of grain. It's about 30 pounds. 30 pounds of grain from this one day's work. And that was going to be enough food for her and Naomi for many, many days. Not only that, Ruth comes back. She gives Naomi her leftovers from the meal that she had earlier. And Naomi knew what Ruth knew, right? Naomi knew that Ruth was a foreigner from the land of Moab, which we're continually reminded about in this story. Naomi must have had some sort of fear in sending out this young woman that didn't have a husband as a foreigner. What field was she going to find herself in? And Ruth comes back and Naomi's like, where did you go? Like, what happened? Naomi, even in her wildest dreams, couldn't have expected Ruth to have a day like this. Here's where the story continues, verse 19. Her mother-in-law said to her, where did you gather barley today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you. And Ruth told her mother-in-law, whom she had worked with, and said, the man of the name I worked with today is Boaz. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may the Lord bless him, because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. Naomi continued, the man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. Ruth, the Moabitess, said, he also told me, stay with my young men till they have finished all of my harvest. So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Ruth, my daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants, so that nothing will happen to you in another field. Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. So Ruth tells Naomi, his name is Boaz. And then Naomi makes a key statement here in the midst of what we just read. Did you catch it? She said, may the Lord bless him because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. And I don't know if it caught your attention, but this statement is really similar to what Naomi said about Orpah and Ruth back in chapter 1. You remember in chapter 1 last week, Naomi said, may the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. And when we looked at this word kindness last week, we said that this was like, I called it A+ grade kindness. It spoke of grace that was given when it wasn't deserved. This word is used specifically in the Old Testament to represent God's loyalty to his people. And Naomi recognized this type of kindness first in Orpah and Ruth, and now she sees the same type of kindness here in Boaz. Then Naomi makes this statement, he is one of our family redeemers. family redeemer. So what does that mean? Well, to be a family redeemer, or maybe you've heard the phrase a kinsman redeemer, it meant that this person was a relative who could act as a redeemer of property and of persons to care for their well-being. In other words, Boaz could act, if he so desired, as a brother-in-law to Ruth in this situation. Remember last week when we touched on this idea as well, that if Naomi had had another son, under the law, he would step forward and marry Ruth to carry on the family line. Now, in this case, Boaz could act as that brother-in-law if he was willing. And Naomi seems to have picked up on that maybe something more is going on here. Ruth tells Naomi, look, I've got permission to be there throughout the harvest season. And Naomi says, that is great news. You should stay there, work with him for as long as you can. He's obviously showing great kindness to you. You're in the right place. Now, as we read this, we don't really have any insight into what Naomi's state of mind is here now. I mean, when we left her at the end of chapter 1, things were pretty grim for her. She says things like, I am bitter, and the Lord has opposed and afflicted me. And she says, I am empty. And even though she's probably still in deep grief over what has transpired, she seems to maybe have a little bit of hope. Maybe she's got just a little bit of that mother's intuition, right? To see where this is going. And she might be able to see that redemption for her and Ruth is right around the corner. But there is still a tension in this story, right? Verse 23 tells us that Ruth stayed out there for several weeks. But then what's going to happen? I mean, the harvest season is going to end. What happens to them after that? Well, that's what we'll talk about next week when we get to chapter 3. I hope you'll come back and join us then. But in the meantime, I want to just take a step back and look at what we've seen in these first 2 chapters so far. Let's face it. Ruth and Naomi are in a hard spot. They're in a hard spot because of what we looked at in chapter 1, right? The fact that they didn't have husbands. And this was an issue of great concern in their culture when it came to their security and their safety and their well-being. They're in a hard spot because of Naomi's emotions and her state of mind. We talked about how when you find yourself in the same state of mind as Naomi, that what helps us persevere is to just look for little ways that God has shown you His mercy and His hope and His grace and His kindness. And we talked about that they're in a hard spot because Ruth was from the land of Moab. And she's coming to a land where she is an outsider. But you know, it's actually this last thing that just keeps standing out to me. We talked last time about how Israel did not view Moab positively. We talked about the reasons for that. But have you noticed just how often this fact that Ruth is from Moab, how often it keeps being mentioned in these first 2 chapters, both directly and indirectly? In the first 2 chapters, there are at least 14 times it's mentioned that Ruth is from Moab. She's a foreigner. She's not from here. Why is this mentioned so often? The author doesn't want you to forget who Ruth is or where she's from, and it's made clear to us in this story. Naomi is hopeless and without security. Ruth is on the outside, undeserving of this grace, without security. And they both needed someone else, someone to come along and be their redeemer. They needed a Boaz. And friends, here is where the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, comes into action. Now, we'll touch more on this theme in the next 2 weeks, week 4 especially. But what is happening here is really a picture of the gospel, because you and I, we're an awful lot like Ruth and Naomi. We go through life's story as foreigners on the outside, hopeless, no security. But along came the ultimate Redeemer, Jesus Christ, giving grace to us when it is completely and wholly undeserved, showing us kindness, giving us life that is far greater, goes far beyond anything that we could have ever asked for or imagined. And Jesus gives us a security and hope that is eternal and without compromise. If you, like Ruth and Naomi, are searching for hope or peace or security, know that you can find it in the person of Jesus Christ, because he has taken on your burden, the guilt of sin, and redeemed you through his blood, the payment for your sin. Even though, like Ruth, you're an outsider. You've done nothing to deserve his grace. You've done nothing to deserve his kindness and his love, but he offers it freely to anyone who would ask. And if you have accepted the free gift of salvation, know that you are resting, like Boaz told Ruth in verse 12, under the wings of the one who can provide true and perfect refuge. Even when we can't always see what God is doing. Just like Ruth, but just so happened to find herself in the field of Boaz. If something we've said has resonated with you and you've got questions about this hope or this security that Jesus Christ provides, would welcome the opportunity to talk with you, to pray with you. Feel free to reach out to us. If you have accepted that gift of salvation, but you're still struggling with hope, you're doubting in the dark, what you know to be true in the light, we welcome the chance to talk with you as well. I hope this has been an encouragement, something we've said has resonated with you. I look forward to continuing this story over the next couple of weeks and seeing how this all ties in to one big story. God bless you. We'll see you next time.